Hey everyone, and welcome back to Malaysia in Focus, your deep dive into the stories that are truly shaping our nation. Because when the country's top corruption fighter is accused of breaking the rules, it's not just about one man's shares. It's about the trust we place in our most important institutions. Okay, let's dive into this. This story has been all over the headlines. It's sparked protests on the streets, and it's raised some pretty uncomfortable questions. And it all revolves around one of the most powerful law enforcement figures in the country, the head of the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, or MACC, Sri Azam Baki. So to really get our heads around what's happening and why it's such a big deal, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with the allegation that kicked this all off, then hear the chief's side of the story. We'll look at the public's reaction, the government's official response, and finally, the bigger conversation this has started about reforming the MACC itself. The whole thing really blew up again thanks to a news report from Bloomberg. And like a lot of big stories, this one started with a number that was just too big for people to ignore. Around 800,000 ringgit. That was roughly the value of shares the MAC chief was reported to own in a company called Velocity Capital Partner. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what? What's wrong with a public official owning some shares? Well, that's where things start to get a little complicated. See, it all comes down to a really specific rule that's designed to stop any potential conflict of interest. There's a government circular that's very clear. Public servants have a strict limit. They cannot own shares worth more than 100,000 ringgit in any one company. The whole point, right, is to make sure their personal finances can't possibly influence their official work. And this, right here, this shows you the problem plain as day. On one side, you have the alleged shares worth almost 800,000 ringgit, and on the other, the official limit of 100,000. That's 8 times the maximum amount allowed. For the head of the very agency that's supposed to fight corruption, this huge gap is what really set off the public alarm bells. If this breakdown is giving you a clearer picture, hit like and subscribe so you'll always stay ahead on Malaysia's biggest issues. All right, so that's the allegation, but of course, there are 2 sides to every story. As you can imagine, Sri Azam Baki has come out swinging, defending himself, and basically saying there's no wrongdoing here. His main argument is that he's been completely transparent about the whole thing. He says the transaction was handed by the book and declared through all the proper channels, and he insists he has nothing to hide. His defense really breaks down into a few key points. First, he says the shares were bought and sold in the same year, way back in 2015, so it was a short-term thing. And crucially, he says he declared it to the Public Service Department using the official online system. Because of all this, he feels the news reports are just malicious, and he's even thinking about suing. He's also completely rejected any calls for him to go on leave while this is being investigated. His argument is pretty simple. He hasn't been charged with a crime. He points out that other officials have stayed in their jobs while facing court cases, and he's basically asking, why should I be treated any different? But you know, that explanation, it just didn't land well with a lot of Malaysians. In fact, it's what pushed this whole issue from angry comments online to actual protests on the streets of Kuala Lumpur. So you had hundreds of people, many of them young, dressed in black as a sign of protest, gathering in the capital. And this was one of the biggest turnouts on this issue since a similar protest back in 2022. It just goes to show how much this story has struck a nerve, especially with a younger generation that's really demanding more accountability. And their demands were loud and clear. You could hear chants of Tangkap Azam Baki, which means arrest Azam Baki. They're calling for his immediate resignation or at the very least suspension. They want a truly independent investigation, not an internal one. And they want the law applied equally to everyone, no exceptions for people at the top. This really highlights the serious political and public pressure that's building up. Even prominent opposition politicians were there, warning that this was just the start, and that the protests will keep happening until they see some real action from the government. Okay, so with protests growing and pressure coming from all sides, the government obviously had to do something, and they've now taken official steps to deal with the controversy. The government's big move was to form a high-level special committee. Its official job is to conduct a really thorough investigation to make sure everything is handled properly and by the book. Now, this committee is made up of some of the country's most senior civil servants. The chairman is the Attorney General himself, the government's top lawyer. But here's the twist. The very people chosen for this committee have sparked even more criticism. Civil society groups like G25, which is made up of respected former top civil servants, are raising red flags. They're basically saying, hang on a minute, For an investigation to be trusted, it doesn't just have to be independent, it has to look independent. And having the government's own lawyer investigate another top official, well, that just doesn't look right to a lot of people. And this is what brings us to the final, and maybe the most important part of this whole story. Because this isn't just about one man's shares or one investigation anymore. It's become a flashpoint for a much, much bigger conversation. This whole episode has kind of forced Malaysia to look in the mirror and ask some really tough questions about the MACC itself. Is it really independent? Can it stand up to political pressure? And governance experts are saying, look, to stop this from happening over and over, you can't just investigate one person. You have to fix the system. Now, what's really interesting here are the concrete ideas people are putting on the table. And these aren't just small tweaks. These are massive structural changes. First, take the MACC out from under the Prime Minister's department and make it answerable directly to Parliament. That puts a buffer between the government and the investigators. Second, create a brand new constitutionally protected body just to watch over the MACC. And third, change how the chief is even picked. Make it a public process with support from all political parties, not just a decision made behind closed doors. Thanks for watching. Join thousands of Malaysians who want clarity, not confusion. Tap like, hit subscribe, and let's keep making sense of this together. So, as this whole thing unfolds, what's really at stake here is so much more than one person's career. It's about the trust of over 30 million Malaysians in the very institutions that are supposed to protect us all from corruption and the abuse of power. And that leaves us with one final crucial question to think about. Is this just another controversy about one person that will eventually fade away once the investigation is over? Or could this be the moment that finally forces real, lasting reform for one of our most important institutions? That's the real test.